Good evening and welcome to Solidarity on Tap. My name is Chris Kerr with the Ignatian Solidarity Network. On behalf of everyone at ISN, as well as our national Solidarity on Tap sponsors, Mary Noel Lay Missioners, Jesuit Volunteer Corps, and Jesuit Volunteer Corps Northwest, thanks for joining us tonight. We're so glad to have you here. For over 15 years, the Ignatian Solidarity Network has been uniting the Ignatian family, meaning the Jesuit network, as well as all of those who are inspired to work for social justice through the spiritual tradition of St. Ignatius of Loyola, to build a more just world through transformational programs and resources that deepen faith and lead to dismantling systematic injustice, collaborative initiatives that bridge divides and overcome exclusion, and collective action to defend and promote the inherent dignity of all God's creation, both people and planet. If you haven't already, please make sure to check out our website, ignatiansolidarity.net, and like and follow us on social media to get the latest advocacy alerts, educational resources, and much more. Now, many of you know this, but for those just joining us for the first time, let me give you the background on Solidarity on Tap. It didn't used to be like this, okay? Really. In the pre-COVID world, it usually took place in cities across the country, bringing together members of the Ignatian family in local bars and pubs. But like many things, come mid-March, we moved virtual, and it's actually been a lot of fun. So we thought we'd keep doing it. And so here we are. I think this is Virtual Solidarity on Tap number 17. We're glad to have you with us tonight. The goal of Solidarity on Tap is the same: to invite people to enjoy fellowship, maybe with a drink in hand, and to hear powerful reflections from members of the network engaged in work for justice. And as always, in order to build and enjoy community tonight, I encourage you to utilize the comments section on Facebook or YouTube, or post to Twitter or Instagram with the hashtag ISNLive to let us know you and your institution are represented here tonight. You can also post your comments and questions for our guest speaker this evening on either Twitter or Facebook. All right, so we want to hear from you. Let us know you're out there. We want to know. All right. I also just want to mention that as we gather tonight as an Ignatian family, we continue to pray for all people affected by COVID-19. We pray for essential workers who continue to support our economy and our nation. We pray for all students, faculty, and staff at hundreds of colleges and high schools across the country who are a part of our work as they enter into these unprecedented times as the academic year begins. Tonight's conversation provides us the opportunity to explore the links between the dignity of workers and Catholic social teaching, especially during the pandemic. Our hope is that this and all Solidarity on Tap conversations can lead us toward a hope-filled future. So with this in mind, I'm excited to introduce our speaker, Joe McCartin. Joseph A. McCartin is a historian of the U.S. labor movement and 20th century U.S. social and political history. He's a professor of history at Georgetown University, where he has taught since 1999, and also serves as the executive director of the Kalmanovitz Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor. His research focuses on the intersection of labor organization, politics, and public policy. His first book, Labor's Great War: The Struggle for Industrial Democracy and the Origins of Modern American Labor Relations, won the 1999 Philip Taft Labor History Book Award. His most recent book, Collision Course: Ronald Reagan, the Air Traffic Controllers, and the Strike That Changed America, examines the origins and implications of the 1981 PATCO strike of air traffic controllers. It won the Richard A. Lester Award for the Outstanding Book on Industrial Relations and Labor Economics, published in 2011. His current research explores the impact of public sector labor organization on politics, government, and private sector labor relations. He's a member of the steering committee of Catholic Scholars for Worker Justice, the editorial committee of Labor Studies in Working Class History of the Americas, and on the board of Interfaith Worker Justice. Joe, welcome. Thanks for being with us tonight.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's really a pleasure to join you.
We're so glad to have you on Solidarity on Tap. Cheers. Since we're here together. Cheers. There we go.
To all the frontline workers.
Yes, exactly. Especially as we see, people struggling so much and workers struggling so much. So absolutely. Now, Joe, you're a professor at Georgetown. You're also, there at the Kalmanovitz Initiative. What has this kind of COVID-19 pandemic reality been like for you in your teaching and in your work with students and other faculty members, both, I guess, thinking back to the spring, but also I think you just started classes recently as well. What's this been like for you?
Well, it's been a crazy ride, as it's been, I think, for very, very many people. For those of us in education, and I mean both at the university level, but also K through 12, I think this is an especially tumultuous time because so many people are starting back to school now. We started back last week. And at Georgetown, we decided in July that given the situation, it seemed just too much to try to reconvene in person. The university worked on some plans early in the summer that would have brought back about half of the students, but been able to separate them enough to keep people safe, we hoped. But then with the surge of the virus again in July, that did not seem realistic. And many of our students are international. They also come from all over the country. And so, people would no doubt be coming from hotspots, and even the best testing we thought wouldn't really be able to contain it. So we've decided to be online. And so that's the way we're doing it. I had my first classes last week. And we're making it work. And I think just as what you said about Solidarity on Tap, this has been hard for everybody, but in some ways, some of the ways we've had to adjust for those of us lucky enough to be in the kind of work that allows for that adjustment, have found that there can be even hidden benefits. Now there are probably people listening to us here who otherwise wouldn't have been able to because you're reaching people all over the country. Similarly, I get to have students from all over the world simultaneously on a Zoom class, and that wouldn't have been possible. So we're adjusting, but I'm mindful even so of how lucky I am as a university professor, able to teach, online in this way. But so many other people, as we know, just don't have that ability. Some of them have lost jobs, and unemployment is more threatening now than at any time since the Great Depression. But, many others just have to put themselves in harm's way, especially those people on the front lines right now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you're right. We do have a lot of folks from around the country watching tonight. I just want to, since you mentioned it, I just want to say hello to some folks. I want to say hello to Raymond, who's joining us from Columbus, Ohio, and Mary Kay from Columbia, Maryland. Nelson is watching from Gardena, California, with the Young Adult Ministry there, and a watch party. Welcome to the watch party. Karen's joining us from Maryland. Kathy from Long Branch, New Jersey. Excellent. Karen says, from our watch party, Irene Tortuga, hi from the Marino Lake Missionaries.
Right, I certainly was.
Volunteer South, and I think Joe was a JV in Houston back in the day.
That's right.
And Ken, brother Ken Holman, a Jesuit brother, is actually there in Washington, D.C., probably close by to you, Joe, and is one of your advisees. So hopefully Ken's staying on track with his academic program. Speaking of your work at Georgetown, can you tell us a little bit about the Kalmanovitz Initiative and the work that it does there? Whoops, Joe, I think we may have lost you there.
Yeah, I froze for a second. Can you hear me now?
You're back. Good. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about the Kalmanovitz Initiative?
Sure. Well, this is one of the things that really makes me so lucky to be at Georgetown. Since 2009, we've launched an initiative at the university called the Kalmanovitz Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor. And what it does is it allows us to bring together faculty and students to work on issues about labor and worker justice in the world today. We offer internships for our students. Many of them get involved with worker organizing or community organizing in DC. And actually, speaking of the opportunities that are now available, because people are spread out all over the place, we've arranged for some internships in other cities during the time of COVID. So we introduce workers to worker justice work to the issues of labor and the working poor. We also we publish research. We host convenings, conferences, and are involved in a whole range of different things. I would encourage people to look for our website where you can learn more about it. It's at lwp.georgetown.edu, LWP for Labor and the Working Poor. So yeah, Chris, the Kalmanovitz Initiative is now about 11 years old, and it's been really a joy for me to be involved in it. So many young people have come through it, and as a result of their exposure to these things, gone out and gotten jobs in organizing, gotten jobs in other worker justice activity. And it's been a really wonderful endeavor, and I'm so thankful for Georgetown University being able to make this happen.
And Joe, you've had the opportunity to see and work with a lot of young people, Georgetown undergraduate, graduates, and graduate students engaged in labor movements, both beyond the confines of Georgetown's campus, but also within the campus, working to stand with and be in solidarity with workers, either on Georgetown's campus or connected to Georgetown's campus. Can you tell us about some of that work over the years?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I came to Georgetown to interview for the job I got in the spring of 1999, and just as I was doing that, and probably I think a week after my campus visit, I read about the fact that students had occupied our president's office. Student activists on campus were trying to get action on the fact that many goods made with the Georgetown logo, sweatshirts and things of that sort, were being made under sweatshop conditions in places like Honduras. And they were trying to create an organization that would police that, and that universities could use as a kind of investigative arm to make sure that anything produced with a university logo good was produced in a fair way, with workers treated well and paid a living wage. Out of that activism in 1999 grew something called the Worker Rights Consortium. It's still active today, the WRC. Georgetown actually became one of its founding members. The then president of Georgetown, the great Jesuit Leo O'Donovan, he listened to those protesters and he agreed that we needed something like that, and Georgetown helped to make it happen. So really you could say from my first exposure to this university, I learned that there was a great core of activist students who cared a lot about workers and who were not afraid even to take risks to defend what they thought was right. And that's been true for my whole time at Georgetown. The group that engaged in that action in 1999 was called Georgetown Solidarity, the Georgetown Solidarity Committee, a student group, and it remained healthy right up until just before we had this closed down, and now I think it's kind of on hiatus. But over the years, the students who've been involved in that group have done a number of remarkable things. They helped our food service workers form a union at Georgetown. They supported adjunct faculty when they formed a union at the university, and they also supported, most recently, graduate assistants forming a union. And then they've also been involved in solidarity activity with workers outside of the university, both domestically and foreign, in foreign places, as they remain connected to the Worker Rights Consortium. So there's been a great activist tradition here, and I've been very, very lucky to work with a number of those great students.
Now, Joe, I think a lot of times people ask the question, about an institution like Georgetown, a Catholic university with deep, mission roots. Say, well, why does an institution like that need to have unions on campus? Like, aren't institutions, committed to their values, that they're gonna treat workers justly? Why is it important for workers to be able to organize and unionize, even in a place that's so mission centered like Georgetown?
Sure. Well, unions, workers coming together to organize and to negotiate collectively with their employer is a good no matter what setting. In fact, if you or any of our watchers were to look at the 1986 pastoral letter from the U.S. Catholic bishops called A Just Economy for All, in that document, the bishops themselves said workers should have a right to unionize, and that includes even those who are employed by church-related entities. And the reason they said that is that looking at their own teaching, they saw that the teaching has upheld the goodness of being together in solidarity and bringing your concerns to your employer in that way. And Georgetown has seen the wisdom, quite frankly, of this. And in each of the cases that I mentioned, the dining hall workers who were not directly employed but by a contractor named Aramark, but also the directly employed workers, some of them in maintenance, also the adjunct professors and the graduate assistants. All of those workers, when they did organize, the university has found that by dealing with them as an organized group, they're often able to lift to the surface problems that the university doesn't want to exist and would happily try to correct if they knew about them. And so by being organized and having that kind of dialogue, it's worked well for both sides. It's not been conflict ridden. In fact, it's been a really cooperative and mutually supportive endeavor.
You know, I was heartened you mentioned the work around the Workers' Rights Consortium, which of course kind of led to Georgetown being a significant supporter of the living wage apparel factory in the Dominican Republic, Altagracia. And I just saw in the news in the past couple of days, Georgetown just made a significant purchase of face masks from Altagracia's living wage factory in the Dominican. And of course, you know, at all levels of Georgetown, you saw support for that type of initiative. And I think that's what's unique about Georgetown is this is not something that just one passionate professor or institute is engaged in, right? This is, you see a deep institutional commitment from the president on down, from initially Father O'Donovan and now Dr. DeGioia to this, which is exciting to see.
Absolutely right. And in that regard, maybe I'll say something about the just employment policy, Chris.
That'd be great. Yeah, I would love to hear more about that.
Exactly. The point is that this hasn't depended upon one leader, and we've been lucky to have great leaders, but it's been an institutional approach, and it's owned by the institution. It's in the culture, and it's in our policy. Back in 2004, again prodded by student activism, students were demanding a living wage for not the directly employed janitors who were already getting that from the university, but the university had a subcontractor that wasn't paying a living wage, and the students believed that that was wrong. And they pressed for a policy that would ensure that even those not directly employed, that any contractor, if they contracted with Georgetown, would agree to pay a living wage. The university looked at that demand and they realized the justice of it. And so they came up with a policy that viewers can look up. If you just Google just employment policy, Georgetown University, you'll find it. And it mandates that workers get a living wage that's now about $17.30 an hour, I think, in compensation. But also the university committed to the idea that workers had a right to organize and form unions. And they made very clear that if you want to be a contractor with the university, you also had to agree to that. And so that policy adopted 15, 16 years ago now has underwritten all of the things that we were just earlier talking about. When food service workers then tried to organize, the university said, yes, we have a policy. And in fact, it reminded the contractor, Aramark, you agreed to this when you came here. You shouldn't fight them if they want to form union. And indeed, Aramark did not. The same when adjuncts and grad assistants tried to organize. So the policy here, I think, is really important. And policy helps to create culture. And policy and culture uphold each other. And, I think it's really important that we not just entrust to the hope of a good, benevolent leader to provide for these kind of things, but that we write them into our institutional law.
You got to get it on the books, right?
Right.
And it seems that the role of then kind of helping the community, the campus community, to understand the implications of a policy like that, right? And the ways that it impacts a community, not just the day it's written or published, but also how it continues to be a key kind of campus document years later is a big piece. And it's great to have an institute like Kalmanovitz to be able to do that good work. So that's exciting to have that. Now, of course, you've tried to take the just employment policy beyond the walls of Georgetown, right, to other campuses. Can you tell us about some of the success and maybe some of the challenges you've faced as you've invited other campus communities into considering such a policy?
We've had interest on a number of other campuses, and some have adopted pieces of policy like this. I think nobody has adopted the full range of the things I've talked about. And I think part of it is that, institutions right now, and I think it's become harder in the past year, and COVID is making it that much more hard, is that institutions have been worried about their bottom line. And I think looking across the Jesuit family of colleges and universities right now, there's a lot of worry about how COVID will affect the financial health of institutions. And so, at times I think when institutions are fearful, putting something on paper like that to be held to becomes scarier. And so it's been a challenge, but it's work that's ongoing, and there are people in many institutions in the network that are looking at it. And as I said, bits of it have been adopted in different places. And so I think we're moving in the right direction with it.
Yeah, it's exciting to know that that's a resource for other universities, other Catholic universities especially, that's out there. So, Joe, we're getting ready to celebrate Labor Day on Monday. And of course, this is a more than 100-year-old tradition in our country, and in states even longer. Kind of celebrating the dignity of work, of especially of organized labor and things like that. But it seems like the reality of organized labor, at least in our country, is very different than it was when that holiday was created in, I think, 1894. Can you talk a little bit about what are we celebrating on Labor Day? What should we be celebrating on Labor Day? What do we need to work on as a nation if we're going to celebrate it properly?
Right. It's a great point. And you obviously know the history. You got the year right, too. Not everybody does. But I would say that actually it's not so much that we're in a different world now as we were in 1894. In fact, I'm struck by a lot of the similarities between the time that produced Labor Day and our current time. That was a tough time. 1894 was the middle of a big depression, the biggest before the Great Depression. It began the year before, and it was a time of a lot of conflict, just like we're seeing around us now in so many ways. In fact, the summer of that year, there had been a march on Washington called Coxey's Army, trying to get federal support for the unemployed. There was also a strike that year, the Pullman strike, that ended up getting put down in part through the use of federal troops. We've seen recently some disturbing examples of troops actually being deployed in our city again, our cities, in ways that we haven't seen in a long time. And so thinking back to the time that Labor Day was formed, a lot of the same kind of struggles that we're seeing today were present in that time. I think one thing that produced the legislation, which was ultimately signed by Grover Cleveland, that made it a holiday, one thing that produced that was the sense that amidst this tumult, something should be done to recognize the dignity of workers, and that helped to spur the national holiday. You might say that, Labor Day is one of those holidays that we have that's been won through social struggle. We wouldn't have this holiday without the fights that preceded it, and including the Pullman strike. Just as we wouldn't have Martin Luther King's holiday without the struggle that preceded that. And now, we are considering maybe Juneteenth as an appropriate marker as well for the struggle that was slavery and the effort to liberate people from it. So, today it's clear that organized labor is not as strong as it once was, but it's been in this position before. And it's bounced back before. And I'm hopeful, looking at a number of things today, that we might see that happen again.
Sure. What would you say are some of the most significant challenges that organized labor faces today?
Well, for one thing, we're operating in the term of in the world of labor and workers' rights with a law that's now more than 80 years old. I mean, this was a law that was passed in 1935, the Wagner Act. It was amended slightly in 1947 in very important ways by the Taft-Hartley Act, but not strengthened, weakened. And then it's stayed on the books in that form ever since. It was a law that was created when our economy looked very different from what it is now. When it was a mass production economy primarily and at the center of it. And it was a law really designed around that kind of model of an economy. We don't have that kind of economy now. And yet effort after effort for the past 40 years to update and modernize that law has been beaten back. Each time by a filibuster in the US Senate. There was an effort in 1965 to make some changes. That got filibustered. There was another one in 1978. That was filibustered to death. In 1994, another. And then in 2010. Each time, efforts to update the law have been crushed. And so one important reason why labor struggles is that it's operating under a legal system that really no longer guarantees workers a meaningful freedom to organize unions. And as a result, workers are not stupid. They know where the power is. And they're reluctant to take risks in an environment where they feel like they could lose their job, even though it's illegal to fire somebody who's trying to form a union, technically under this law, at least if they're covered. Many workers are not covered by it. Uber drivers, for example. Farm workers are not covered by it. Those who are covered are afraid that even though the law says that, they know and they've heard and they've seen in many cases that lawyers can violate the law with impunity. The penalties are meager. And in fact, it's in the employer's interest, if they don't want a union, to just break the law. And many do. So a lot of it has to do with that problem.
Sure. Yeah. Joe, you mentioned both Martin Luther King and you mentioned Juneteenth.
Yeah.
We need to take a little break and thank our sponsors and also give a couple updates. When we come back, I'd love to talk about the intersections between labor rights and racial justice and explore that a little bit. All right. So hold on. We'll be back to you in a minute. All right. So I want to take a few seconds to tell you ways you can connect with the work of the Ignatian Solidarity Network. And then I also want to make sure we say thanks again to our sponsors. So after tuning in for our conversation this evening, we want to invite you to take the next step of supporting ethical labor practices. 2 weeks ago, we spoke with at Solidarity on Tap with Libby O'Brien with Collection, a company in North Carolina producing ethical textile products. You can support their important work and do your part to mitigate the spread of COVID-19 by ordering a face mask, just like this one. It's available in ISN's web store in two styles, one declaring that voting is an act of love in the lead up to election 2020, and our popular Solidarity mask. So I want to make sure you check them out at igsol.net. That's igsol.net/masks. And I also wanted to mention that this work in North Carolina was recently featured in National Catholic Reporter. And as you can see here on the screen, we invite you to follow this link and to read the full story and learn more about that dynamic work that's happening. Worker-owned factories, textile factories there that are producing masks like this and lots of other textile products. So we hope you'll check that article out and learn more about the story behind a face mask, that you could read that story and have a real understanding of the people that made this, the energy that went into making this product. So speaking of the Voting as an Act of Love campaign, this fall, you can exercise the right and responsibility to vote for candidates and issues that support the common good and concern for the most vulnerable people in our society. You can join ISN's Voting is an Act of Love campaign to register and to commit to vote and to mobilize your community. You can get involved at igsol.net. That's igsol.net/vote. Also, from October 19th to the 26th, you can be a part of the first ever virtual Ignatian Family Teach-In for Justice. You can join the largest annual Catholic social justice gathering in the country from a screen near you. Join us for incredible speakers, including Father Brian Massengale, Olga Segura, Mauricio Lopez, Father Greg Boyle, Father James Martin, Bishop Mark Seitz, and Sister Helen Prejean. Lots of exciting speakers. You can register at ignatiansolidarity.net/IFTJ. Also, just to put in a quick plug, applications are available for those interested in presenting at the teach-in, and you can find details at igsol.net. That's igsol.net/speakers. Also, lots of things happening this fall. This September, the Ignatian Solidarity Network will honor Sister Simone Campbell, Executive Director of Network, Catholic Social Justice Lobby, and also well known for her work with Nuns on the Bus. And we'll also honor Father John Bauman, the founder of PICO, the Pacific Institute for Community Organization, which is now known as Faith in Action. It's actually the largest faith-based community organizing organization in the country. They're going to be honored for their significant commitment to leadership for social justice at the Ignatian Solidarity Network's annual Ignite, a celebration of justice event. Now, due to COVID-19, like a lot of things, including our time here tonight, the event will be held virtually on September 23rd, 2020. It would have been in San Francisco, and only people in the San Francisco area would have been able to join us. But because it's virtual, you can be with us that night. So we hope you'll join us. You can learn more at ignatiansolidarity.net/ignite. And now, let me tell you about our sponsors, all right? Maryknoll Lay Missioners work internationally with those at the margins for a more just, compassionate, and sustainable world. To learn more about their work, join Meet a Missioner Monday live streams on their Facebook page every Monday at 11 o'clock Eastern Time. So we hope you can join them Mondays at 11. Secondly, the Jesuit Volunteer Corps, JVC, is a full-time volunteer program that works for social justice while exploring spirituality and faith through a framework of Catholic Ignatian values for individuals between the ages of 21 and 35. You can learn more about JVC at jesuitvolunteers.org. Also, JVC Northwest, which is focused on core values of community, simple living, social and ecological justice, and spirituality and reflection. JVC Northwest is a national direct AmeriCorps program serving in 24 locales across Alaska, Idaho, Montana, Oregon, and Washington. And you have to be over 21 to be eligible to apply for JVC Northwest. And you can learn how to apply at jvcnorthwest.org. We also invite you to join us for upcoming Solidarity on Taps, continuing every 2 weeks throughout the fall. You can see the lineup of our upcoming speakers here on the screen, and you can learn more at igsol.net/SOT. That's igsol.net/SOT. I also want to make sure you know that if you like the conversation this evening and want to share it or watch it again, this episode of Solidarity on Tap and all our previous Solidarity on Tap videos are available at ignatiansolidarity.net or on our YouTube and Facebook pages. So don't worry, you can go back and watch every minute. And if you enjoy Solidarity on Tap, please consider giving a gift to sustain the work of the Ignatian Solidarity Network at ignatiansolidarity.net/donate. And also, because there wasn't enough going on already, If you're watching tonight, I heard there's some watch parties out there. You can share a picture of yourself watching or having a Zoom virtual watch party to your Instagram account and tag Ignatian Solidarity. And make sure to use that hashtag ISN Live so that we can feature your story in our next Instagram Solidarity on Tap story. So make sure to let us know you're out there, okay? And speaking of posting things on social media, we'd love to have your questions. We'd love to know who else is watching tonight, so don't hesitate to make sure you tell us about that as well. And I think we have some other folks who are watching. Mercy's joining us from Raleigh, North Carolina, and Carrie is with us from Detroit. Welcome, Carrie. Great to have you with us as well. Joe, let's go back to this right away. Why mess around? Labor rights and racial justice. What are the connections?
Well, they're deeply intertwined, and in some ways, not in such healthy ways. For example, in the early years of the union movement in the United States, many of the unions that formed and crafts in the late 19th century, they barred Black members. They were all white organizations, and they made it hard for some Black workers to get a start in industry. So it's not always been a happy story, just like American history in general. But over time, the labor movement changed and evolved on the race question. By the 1930s, when the industrial unions were being formed, unions like the United Automobile Workers, the steel workers, and the meat packers unions, they were multiracial organizations. And in fact, they stood for civil rights. And in fact, by the 1960s, the UAW, the auto workers, the meat packers unions, they were important supporters of the civil rights struggle. The labor movement lobbied on behalf of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but that's not to say that there weren't issues along the years between those things. But for the most part, I would say that over the course of the 20th century, there was a deep and positive intertwining of labor and civil rights struggle. We saw that really expressed in what happened in 1968 when the Memphis sanitation workers struck. African-American workers who did not have a right to form a union or strike as municipal employees in Memphis. Martin Luther King went to their defense, of course, and he was assassinated there. Those workers were members of AFSCME, the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. That union was a really strong civil rights union, remains so to this day. And I think in the years since the 60s, there's been an even deeper intertwining of labor and civil rights struggle. And we saw that, I think, recently, if anybody was following the Poor People's Campaign, which, was also impacted by COVID, could not have the March on Washington this summer in the way they planned it, but they had a digital march which drew thousands, or rather millions, led by Reverend Barber. That movement was really strongly united with some of our leading unions, including the Service Employees Union, SEIU, and the American Federation of Teachers. And we've seen in recent times, in recent months, a lot of unions making more effort to get involved in Black Lives Matter organizing. That's not to say everybody, because many police are in unions, and that's become an issue too. And it's become a controversy actually within the labor movement as to whether those unions should be allowed to remain.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. What about at Georgetown? I mean, there's been so much work happening around racial equity and kind of
right.
reconciling with Georgetown's history related to slavery. How has that interplayed or intersected, or maybe become, I don't know, maybe struggle to work together amidst kind of the work around labor rights on campus for different sectors of the campus population?
Wonderful question. So, the stuff I was describing earlier and how the university came to take a strong stand on worker justice issues, I think laid the groundwork for what happened several years later, which is in the process of renovating the old Jesuit residence to turn it into a dorm for students. It was called Milady. They discovered that the person after whom the dorm was named was actually involved in the 1830s in the sale of slaves, then owned by the Maryland province of the Jesuits, to families in Louisiana. A sale which, by the way, took place over the orders of the Vatican not to do this, and of Rome, of the Jesuit superiors not to do it. The university realized that it had an issue regarding its connection to slavery in the past. And instead of trying to brush over or cover over it, it actually took a deep dive into that issue. Many of my colleagues in the history department were involved in it. People like Maurice Jackson, Marcia Chatelain, great African-American historians, Adam Rothman, David Collins, the Jesuit, and they looked into this history, but it became more than a history project. It became a challenge to the university. First, understand this history. Second, begin to think about what does it mean? How do we do justice in light of this history? And the university is still figuring out the answer to that latter question. It's working with the descendants of the enslaved people. And with students and others who've been working on this to try to find what is the best way to honor the legacy of that time, to do justice, to engage in some form of repair for what occurred. And that's been a really important exercise. It's ongoing. One of the people who is deeply involved in it was one of my former students, Ph.D. students, named James Benton. He's now left the president's office where he worked on that. And he works with me at the Kalmanovitz Initiative now on a project called the Racial Equity and Empowerment Project. And what that's about is to think about the African-American community of DC and the people of color in DC and the workers in DC now and the kinds of situation they're facing, and to come up with first a deeper understanding of the problems, but also to work with them towards solutions. So James has been heavily involved in that. And so I think there's a connection over time between the way the university has looked at its labor issues and how it's now trying to grapple with the issue of race. And in fact, through all of American history, the issues of labor and race have always been intertwined since 1619, since the first enslaved people arrived in Jamestown. And so it's an ongoing struggle, but I feel like we're taking some concrete steps now. We're not done by any stretch of the imagination, but we're at least recognizing the problem and the need for action.
Yeah. Joe, you mentioned some of your Black colleagues in the history department there at Georgetown. What, I think we've heard from a lot of Black partners in this work and on campuses about the need for allyship in the work for racial equity and to end white supremacy. What does allyship look like for you as a colleague with those folks and other members of the Georgetown community? What does that look like to you?
Right. Allyship is so important, I think. And, I think that I like many, I'm learning as I go. And I look to my colleagues who provide real leadership on this. People like Marcia Chatelain and Maurice Jackson, and James Benton now, who works with me and help me understand, the depth of the issues involved and how to work together. And I think the most important thing in terms of allyship is listening to how people see it. I think in Catholic social teaching, right, it's the idea of first you see, then you discern, then you act on the teaching. And our first job, I think, is to see, but also to hear and to listen. And so the first job of the ally, I think, is to open your ears and to open your eyes.
Thanks for that. Joe, we didn't mention this in your bio, but you're a graduate of the College of Holy Cross. You're a former Jesuit volunteer. You served in Houston in the early 80s. And you're in the, through your academic discipline today, you're deeply committed to work for justice and, in the context of labor rights and worker dignity and things like that. What are some things that impacted your path? How did you get to be where you are today?
Right. Excellent. I grew up in a industrial city, a declining industrial city in upstate New York, Troy, New York. It was once known as the collar city. They used to make detachable collars for shirts. If you've seen old movies, those collars can come right off of shirts sometimes. And that's what they made in Troy. And I had ancestors who worked in that work. And I grew up in a family that I'd say was middle class, but in a working class milieu, and always knowing about what it was to work, and my family certainly did that. I was educated in Catholic schools from kindergarten through college, through Holy Cross. And when I arrived at Holy Cross, I went there thinking I'd be a medical doctor, but that I was going to be going in that direction. I was a chemistry major at first, but I took some history classes as electives, and they just opened my eyes. First of all, they talked to me about people like the people I grew up with and places like the city I grew up with, and understanding the past of those places. I had a couple of hugely influential teachers. One was Nick Salvatore. He became a great labor historian. He later moved to Cornell, now retired. The other was David O'Brien, who's in many ways maybe the dean of historians of the American Catholic social tradition. And David became my advisor. And through him, I came to realize that there was this whole world of things that one could do around the values that I'd been raised in. I left the idea of medical school behind. I ended up joining the Jesuit Volunteer Corps, going to Houston in 1981, and working in neighborhoods of people of color and learning about a world I did not know about, and being taught by the people I worked with about things that I needed to learn. And it was out of that experience that, I really found my vocation. And decided that, the kinds of things that I was witnessing and seeing and the people I was talking to, I wanted to tell their stories. And so I went back to graduate school and started to study history with the idea of writing about working people. And so luckily that's what I found myself doing, and I've loved doing it. I did it for, more than 10 years before I arrived at Georgetown. But moving to Georgetown and being back in the Jesuit world, I taught at a couple of state universities in Rhode Island and then in Geneseo, New York. Before that, being back in the Jesuit world allowed me to reconnect with a lot of these foundational values and people. Networks like ISN. And then out of that to sort of bring about a kind of revival of that kind of influence in my life. And I've been very lucky with that. And again, the colleagues, the students I've had here, the university and how it's tried to lead on these issues. I think all of that, make me feel so fortunate. But that's my story and how I ended up here. And my raising in that tradition, and that tradition still living in me now, in what I do, that meant everything.
That's great. Thanks for sharing your story, Joe. I asked your colleague, Marcia Chatelain, this question. She's a historian as well, and I realize I'm not supposed to ask historians to talk about the future, but I was curious to know, as a historian, as you look at this place in time, particularly related to the pandemic, what do you think historians will say about this time period? And maybe, for you specifically, looking at issues of labor and things like this. What will historians say about this time period, looking back 50 years from now, do you think?
Well, I think first that depends on us and what we do. And I think it depends on some decisions that we as individuals and as a community make in the next couple of years. I don't just mean this November, though I think that's really important. I mean what follows that, and what kind of vision we have for the future. I can think of two possibilities looking backward from 50 years from now, that people might look at this as the time when we lost our democracy, when we descended into a really ugly way of being as a nation. I think that's possible. Sad to say, I don't think we've been in a situation quite like this, I think, since the late 1850s in terms of the degree of polarization that we have in the country. Or people could look back 50 years from now and say, that was the nadir, that was the bottom, and then they built up from there. They could look back in the future and see what we see when we look at 1931, 1932. Who knew how that Great Depression was going to turn out? It certainly spawned a lot of mayhem. It brought Hitler to power. It helped push us toward a world war that was unrivaled in its bloodshed. It was savage. Terrible things happened. But out of that difficult time, the country came together in a pretty profound way, not only to defeat fascism, but also to build a much more humane and democratic country than had existed before that. None of that was inevitable. That was the product of what people did. And so I think it's going to be similarly up to us. People will judge this time by what we do in the next couple of years, I think.
Sure. Thanks for that, Joe. I have one last question before we let you go. We've asked this of a lot of our guests on Solidarity on Tap. It's kind of a simple question, but in your work, what gives you hope these days?
Yeah, that's a great question. And here's a wonderful thing about the study that I do. I study workers, and I study, people who don't have power for the most part. And I've spent my life studying them and their movements, back from, slavery time all the way through the struggles of the 19th century and into the 20th. And often, the stories that I'm writing about are stories of struggle and what seems to be defeat. You mentioned in introducing me that one of my books is about the 1981 air traffic controller strike, the PATCO strike, which Ronald Reagan broke, in which many people, and I think this is an important point about it, point to as a real turning point leading to bad times for the American labor movement and for American workers. So a lot of the things I've studied have to do with struggle and defeat and reorganization and struggle again. And I think what I learned from that and what's applicable to our time is a sense of human resiliency and of what hope itself is, right? I often tell students about the field of labor history that it's not a very good field for optimists, right? Optimism is not really sustained by a lot of these stories. However, it is a great field for hope, because what you see over and over in these stories is that even when people are defeated, defeats often sow the seeds for breakthroughs that come later that we never could have anticipated. What seems to be a defeat ends up being something quite different, radically different often. And this shouldn't surprise us in our connection to our tradition, right? And to the idea of resurrection, and to the idea that the broken can be made whole again. And so I often get to see this actually happening in history. And, you know, in this time, which is a, you know, really difficult time right now, we're seeing a lot of suffering, a lot of hurt, a lot of pain. I think even simply the loss of that $600 to the unemployed recently, that's hurting people. And I have a friend right now who's a high school teacher in Connecticut, and they're telling him he's got to go back into the classroom. He has a genetic condition that would put him in danger of death if he gets COVID. But he's been given a choice. Either you go back or you claim sick days. He's got 43 built up. And when they're done, you can go on leave, unpaid leave. And that's just one story of one person I know. There are many, many stories of real pain going on now. And I think, you know, when I hear those kind of stories, I do think about this principle, which I've seen so often, that even out of this kind of pain and this kind of moment, extraordinary things can happen. And, you know, I'm hopeful.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks for rooting that response and in that story of your friend and emphasizing the importance of listening in your response to my question about allyship too, of listening, how vital that is, and work for solidarity and work for justice. So we're so grateful to have you with us tonight, and for the work of the Kalmanovitz Initiative at Georgetown. It's been a great partner of the Ignatian Solidarity Network for many years. So thank you for that work. Continued good luck and blessings in your teaching during this challenging virtual semester and challenging time for Catholic higher education and for just the work of universities. So thanks again for being with us, and thanks to everyone for joining us. I know we got some questions that came in really late in the game. We're sorry we didn't get to them, but thanks for being with us. We hope you can join us in 2 weeks. We'll be talking about the U.S. Census in the context of poverty and justice, and so we're looking forward to welcoming a guest from the U.S. Census Bureau to discuss those important issues during this key time for the 2020 census. So thank you to everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you, Chris.